She was there to observe. Now, she's the target. What ignited their suspicion?
Welcome to Whispered Truth, where touching stories come alive. Let's jump into today's story.
The fluorescent lights of Gate C-37 hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony playing out in Aisha's mind. She adjusted her scarf, the silk a thin shield against the chill of the airport terminal, and pulled her carry-on bag closer. The weight of it felt significant, not just in pounds, but in the expectations it carried. She wasn't just Aisha Davis, a 34-year-old public relations director. Today, she was a ghost, a silent observer embedded in the fabric of the very airline she represented, a wolf in sheep's clothing, or in this case, an executive in a well-tailored pantsuit and nondescript Converse sneakers. The internal memo, sealed and labeled Operation Eagle Eye, lay like a burning coal in her handbag. Her mission was simple: assess the passenger experience firsthand, and more specifically, to gauge if the airline's glossy diversity and inclusion campaign held any weight beyond pretty press releases. A subtle but crucial task lay beneath the surface, to see if her colleagues' biases were grounded in reality or prejudice. She glanced at the departure board. Flight 812 to Denver, boarding in 10 minutes. Her stomach clenched with a cocktail of nerves and anticipation. She'd done her homework. She'd even watched hours of flight attendant training videos, absorbing the emergency procedures, the forced smiles, and the subtle choreography of cabin service. Still, the real thing was always different, the human element a variable too messy for any script. She'd chosen the window seat, hoping for a moment of respite before the orchestrated chaos began. She felt a sudden surge of fatigue, the weight of recent board meetings, and endless edits to press releases, like a relentless tide threatening to pull her under. She knew, however, that this wasn't a time to retreat. She had to show up, not just as herself, but as a representation of her entire community. She couldn't allow anyone's prejudices to shape her experience. She had to be vigilant. The boarding process was a well-oiled machine, a human conveyor belt efficiently moving passengers towards the promise of departure. Aisha settled into her seat, securing her bag in the overhead bin. The rhythmic clatter of luggage being stowed was almost hypnotic. She noted the other passengers, a young family with a toddler, a businessman engrossed in his laptop, a couple holding hands, oblivious to the world around them. None of them seemed to notice her, and she was grateful for it, at least for the time being. The hum of the plane's engines began to rise, a deep growl that resonated in her bones. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to center herself, letting the gentle roar wash over her. This was her chance to see things clearly, to be invisible, to listen to the truth that wasn't always spoken in boardrooms and press conferences. The plane taxied to the runway, the movement slight but palpable. A jolt, then they were airborne, the ground receding as the city's sprawling grid transformed into a patchwork of shimmering lights. Aisha opened her eyes, watching the world shrink below, a miniature replica of the reality she had just left behind. A familiar feeling of dislocation swept over her, the same feeling she'd often get in those moments between arriving and settling into a new city when she'd been a kid, moving from one neighborhood to another across the country, a perpetual dance of reinvention. It was a strange comfort, this feeling of being untethered, of being in between. Her phone pinged with a text from her best friend, Lena, a brief message saying, "Good luck, undercover boss. Don't let those Karens get to you," Aisha smiled, the message both humorous and a reminder why she was doing this. It wasn't just about the airline, it was about making sure that someone, somewhere felt seen, felt safe, felt valued. The flight attendants began their service, their movements practiced and precise. Aisha watched them with a critical eye, noting their interactions with the passengers. One flight attendant, a young man with a genuine smile, offered her a beverage with a cheerful demeanor. Another, an older woman with a tired look, seemed more focused on efficiency than empathy. It was a microcosm of human behavior, playing out within the confines of a metal tube suspended 30,000 feet in the air. The cabin lights dimmed as the dinner service commenced. The aroma of airline food, vaguely identifiable as chicken, filled the air. Aisha, for all her meticulous planning, had not anticipated how hungry she would be. She accepted the tray with a quiet nod, not yet willing to fully engage, still trying to remain an observer. The monotony of the meal was broken by a sudden commotion a few rows behind her. A man's voice, laced with frustration, rose above the low hum of the engines. "My wallet, it's gone. I swear someone stole it." A wave of discomfort washed over Aisha. This was exactly the kind of unexpected variable that made this assessment both so necessary and so fraught with risk. She observed the situation, taking in the man's distressed expression and the anxious glances of the passengers around him. A flight attendant quickly approached, his tone calm but cautious. "Sir, can you describe your wallet?" The man, middle-aged, balding, and wearing a rumpled business suit, began to recount his belongings, his voice growing increasingly agitated. Aisha watched the drama unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Then she saw a glint of suspicion in the eyes of Captain Robert Miller, who had emerged from the cockpit and joined the flight attendant. His gaze swept across the passengers, pausing for a disconcertingly long moment on Aisha. It wasn't a quick glance, it was an analytical assessment. The kind that made her hair prickle on the back of her neck. The captain, his face a mask of barely concealed distrust, walked straight towards her. He leaned forward slightly, his voice tight. "Excuse me, ma'am," he started, his eyes narrowed. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Aisha's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low hum of the plane's engines. The captain's question, seemingly innocuous on the surface, hung in the air like a threat. Her carefully constructed facade of anonymity began to crumble. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Captain," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "What can I help you with?" The other passengers, initially focused on the distraught man, now turned their attention towards her. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with unspoken assumptions and simmering tension. She saw a flicker of unease in the eyes of the flight attendant, a subtle shift in his posture, as if he already knew what was coming. She thought of her grandmother, who had always taught her the importance of maintaining her poise even when facing injustice. Captain Miller didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "We have a passenger who has reported a missing wallet," he stated, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. "Given the circumstances, we need to be thorough." He gestured towards her carry-on bag, which was neatly stowed under the seat in front of her. "Would you mind if we took a look at your bag, just to rule out any possibilities?" He said this with an air of false civility, but it wasn't lost on Aisha that he hadn't addressed that same request to any other passenger. A jolt of anger coursed through Aisha, hot and sharp. This wasn't about thoroughness, it was about prejudice. It was the kind of assumption she had fought against her entire life, the casual bigotry hidden beneath the guise of procedure. Her mind raced, analyzing the situation from every angle. She could comply, allow the search, and play the role of the cooperative, unassuming passenger. Or she could push back, assert her rights, and expose the underlying bias. She glanced at the other passengers, the uncomfortable silence, the averted eyes. She thought about the message from Lena, the Karen's comment suddenly feeling less humorous and more of a prophecy. Aisha knew she couldn't allow this injustice to pass unchallenged. "Captain," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I understand your need to investigate, but I must ask, on what grounds are you singling me out?" The question, clear and direct, cut through the tense atmosphere. She could feel the weight of every eye on her. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing the countless others who had been subjected to this kind of casual discrimination, the unspoken assumptions that judged a book by its cover. Captain Miller's face hardened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure," he insisted, his voice laced with impatience. "It's standard protocol when an incident like this occurs." Standard procedure, Aisha repeated, raising an eyebrow. So, you conduct bag searches on all passengers when someone reports a theft? Or is it just me? Have you asked all the other passengers? Because I didn't see you stop any other passenger. She made sure to add a tone of sarcastic politeness, a shield against his simmering hostility. She was being strategic now, playing the game, but by her rules. She wasn't letting him control this narrative. The captain didn't seem to like her challenge, and his eyes flashed with anger. Look, ma'am, I don't have time for this. We need to find this wallet. Are you going to cooperate? Or are you going to make this more difficult? He stepped closer to her, his physical presence becoming more imposing, his voice losing all pretense of courtesy. The flight attendant standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. He, like everyone else on the plane, seemed to understand what was happening, or at least what was about to happen.
Wait! Sorry to interrupt you, but please subscribe to our channel Whispered Truth and reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your subscribe and like helps us a lot, and comment your favorite part. Now let's get back to the story.
Aisha held her ground. She wasn't intimidated by his posturing. I will cooperate, Captain, when you show me reasonable cause for this search, not before I have rights. She spoke with a conviction that surprised even herself. This wasn't just about a missing wallet. It was about dignity, about the right to exist without being judged by the color of her skin. She knew the consequences of her actions, a possible escalation, an even more intrusive search, even detention. But she knew she couldn't back down, because it was precisely this kind of unchecked behavior that perpetuated injustice. Her earlier feelings of being an observer had evaporated. She was now a participant, the center of a storm she had not anticipated, but felt obligated to weather. The captain seemed to deflate slightly, his earlier bravado replaced with a flicker of frustration. He obviously wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who he deemed to be of a lower class. Fine, he spat out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Then we'll just have to do this a hard way. He turned towards the flight attendant, nodding curtly. Get me security. The flight attendant nodded, his face pale, and quickly made his way towards the front of the plane. The other passengers watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Some whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting back and forth between Aisha and the captain. Aisha's mind raced. She'd expected some level of scrutiny, but this felt different. This felt calculated, deliberate. Her own role as an observer had turned on its head. She was the object now, a subject of suspicion and unwarranted scrutiny. She knew that the longer this went on, the more damaging it would become, not just for herself but for the airline. The irony wasn't lost on her. The person tasked with promoting the airline's image was now embroiled in a situation that could become a public relations nightmare. Captain Miller stood there, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Aisha with a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite decipher. She could feel her own anger simmering, but she kept her expression calm, her posture erect. She thought about all the things her mother had taught her, the quiet strength she'd instilled in her. She knew that her mother would be proud of her, that she had always been a fighter, and she was just getting started. The plane seemed to have become very small, all the space and comfort stripped away. She felt as if she was on display, a specimen under a microscope, stripped of her identity, reduced to a stereotype. The captain had wanted to show his authority, but he had inadvertently showcased his own inherent prejudices. She wondered, as the plane slowly descended towards Denver, if he could see that too. A heavy feeling settled in her stomach. She could taste the bitterness of injustice. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle thud, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Aisha. The cabin was silent, the usual sounds of landing, the unbuckling of seatbelts, the murmur of conversations muted, replaced by an almost palpable tension. The flight attendants, their forced smiles absent, moved through the aisles with a hurried efficiency, as if eager to disembark and escape the charged atmosphere. Captain Miller, his face still set in a tight mask, made his way back to the cockpit without even glancing in her direction. It was a silent victory for her, but not one she took any pride in. She had successfully asserted her rights, but it felt hollow. She knew the real battle was about to begin. She could feel her skin begin to prickle, the feeling of being singled out once again. The plane taxied to the gate, the sounds of the airport growing louder, a dissonant symphony of human activity. As the door opened, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the cabin. They were men of few words, their expressions stern, their eyes scanning the passengers with an almost clinical detachment. One of them, a tall, imposing figure with a neatly trimmed mustache, walked directly towards Aisha. "Miss Davis," he asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Aisha nodded, her stomach clenching. The surreal nature of the situation washed over her. She, a senior executive of this very airline, was now being treated like a criminal. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow, but she refused to allow it to break her spirit. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. She thought of the stories she'd heard, the casual racism faced by so many, the way people were treated as suspicious because of the color of their skin, the kind of fear she could now see in the face of those passengers who'd now began to disembark. They were all looking at her now. "We need you to come with us," the officer continued, gesturing towards the exit. "We need to ask you some questions." The tone of his voice left no room for debate. Though she couldn't see his face, she could tell he felt the weight of his own task. She could almost feel his discomfort. Aisha rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her gaze unflinching. She retrieved her carry-on bag and walked towards the security officers, her head held high. She refused to cower, refused to let their assumptions define her. She walked through the aisle, the other passengers parting like the Red Sea, their eyes fixed on her as if she was some kind of spectacle. She ignored the stares, the whispers, the judgment. This wasn't about them, it was about her own fight for respect. She would not let this moment break her. She followed the security officers off the plane, the walk to the terminal feeling like an eternity. The bright lights of the airport seemed to amplify the feeling of being on display. They led her to a small, nondescript room, a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. The room was bare, furnished with a table and a couple of chairs. The lack of comfort made it seem like an interrogation room, ripped straight from a bad cop show. The air felt heavy, stale with unspoken accusations. The officer with the mustache gestured towards a chair, his expression remaining unchanged. "Please, have a seat, Miss Davis," he said, his voice still flat. He and his partner sat across from her, their postures mirroring each other, their hands resting on the table. She noted how they hadn't offered any water, didn't even seem to acknowledge that she may have been scared, just raw efficiency, like robots. She sat down and placed her carry-on bag beside her chair, the weight of her laptop almost a comfort at this point. The interrogation began with a series of routine questions. Her name, her date of birth, her address, her purpose for traveling. She answered them calmly, her voice steady, her responses precise. Then, the questions shifted, becoming more pointed, more accusatory. "We understand there was an incident on the plane," the officer with the mustache began, his eyes narrow. "A passenger reported a missing wallet. The captain seemed to think that you were involved." Aisha felt a surge of anger, a familiar burning sensation in her chest. "I'm not involved," she stated firmly, her voice sharp. "I have nothing to do with the missing wallet. I am simply an innocent passenger who was unjustly targeted because of the color of my skin." She didn't mince words, her anger now a tangible force that filled the room. She'd had enough of polite acquiescence, enough of tiptoeing around people's biases. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth. They knew at some level that she was being targeted. They knew that it wasn't protocol, but they were still doing it. "We just need to follow procedure, Miss Davis," the mustache officer said, his voice regaining its detached tone. "We need to search your bag." Aisha felt a wave of nausea. This was it. She could refuse again, but she knew where that would lead: more questions, more intimidation. The whole situation was designed to break her down. "Fine," she said with as much calm as she could muster. "You can search my bag, but understand that it is only because I am tired, not because I'm guilty. I know my rights." She unzipped the bag and carefully emptied the contents onto the table. Her laptop, her notebook, a few magazines, a water bottle, her toiletry bag. They meticulously inspected each item, turning it over in their hands, peering at it with a thoroughness that was both invasive and unnecessary. She watched them, her eyes narrowed with contempt. The search yielded nothing. There was no wallet, no stolen property, nothing even remotely suspicious. The officers looked at each other, a flicker of surprise in their eyes, almost like they were disappointed she wasn't guilty. The mustache officer let out a sigh, a barely audible sound that seemed to carry the weight of their collective assumptions. They looked up at Aisha, and she could see the shift in their demeanor. They seemed to finally recognize the error in their ways. They now recognized she wasn't some criminal, she was just like everyone else. "Miss Davis," the officer said, his voice now softer, "we apologize for the inconvenience. It appears we have made a mistake. There was no evidence of you stealing anything." He didn't quite meet her eyes. Aisha stared at him, her anger slowly giving way to a deep sense of weariness. This wasn't about their apology. This wasn't about the stolen wallet. This was about all of her life experiences, the casual judgments, the microaggressions, the blatant acts of racism. She had been targeted, she had been profiled, and she was utterly exhausted. The words she wanted to say burned in her throat, the things that would take far longer to unpack than the search they had just conducted. "An inconvenience?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is that what you call it? An inconvenience? To be treated like a criminal, to be searched without cause, to be humiliated in front of my fellow passengers. This is more than just an inconvenience. This is a violation. This is racism. And I want you both to understand that I will not forget this." Her voice was finally shaking. Aisha stepped out of the sterile interrogation room and back into the chaotic energy of the airport terminal. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, the sounds of the crowds louder, more jarring. The sense of isolation she had felt during the questioning was replaced by an overwhelming awareness of the countless faces, all of them strangers, each with their own stories, their own biases, their own judgments. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was walking through a gauntlet of unspoken disapproval. She was a victim of discrimination, and it felt like an open wound. She retrieved her phone from her bag, the screen lighting up with a string of missed calls and texts. Lena had called multiple times, her messages filled with concern and anger. Her colleague, Ben, had also texted, expressing confusion about her absence. She had a message from David Lee, the CEO of the airline, a brief, formal inquiry about her whereabouts. She scrolled through them, feeling a mix of gratitude and resentment. She was grateful for the support, but she was also resentful that she had to go through this, that she had to rely on others to recognize the injustice she had endured. She wanted to be heard, she wanted to be seen, and she didn't want to rely on anyone else to do that for her. She found a quiet corner near a deserted gate and sank onto a chair, letting the weight of the day wash over her. Her muscles ached, her head throbbed, her emotions were a tangled mess of anger, frustration, and exhaustion. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. She couldn't just brush it aside as an unfortunate incident. This was not just about her. It was about all the others who had been subjected to similar treatment, the ones who didn't have the resources, the platform, or the voice to fight back. She took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to decide what to do next. She texted Lena back, a brief message explaining the situation, promising to call her later. Then, she typed a longer, more detailed email to David Lee, outlining the events of the flight, the captain's actions, the security's interrogation. She wrote with a cold precision, her emotions carefully controlled, her facts clear, concise, and unassailable. She made sure to be as detailed as possible, so no one could deny what had happened. She included everything. She also made it clear that she expected immediate action, that she would not tolerate any kind of cover-up or half-hearted response. She ended the email with a simple but powerful statement: "This is unacceptable, and I will not stand for it." She attached the email, her thumb hovering over the send button. She had no idea what the consequences would be, but she knew she couldn't remain silent. It was her responsibility to say something. She pressed send. She knew she had a flight back home scheduled later that day, but she had no intention of boarding it. She had a job to do and she wasn't finished. She needed to talk to David. She needed to make him understand what had happened, not just on a professional level, but on a human level. She had to show him how the airline's policies were failing, how their claims of diversity and inclusion were nothing but empty words. She knew this would be difficult, that it would involve challenging the status quo, but she was ready. She wasn't going to allow a single act of prejudice to undo all the hard work she had done, all the sacrifices she had made. As if on cue, her phone rang. It was David Lee. She took a deep breath and answered the call. "David," she said, her voice steady. "I've sent you an email outlining what happened. I need to speak to you in person." "Aisha," David's voice sounded rushed, his tone a mixture of concern and urgency. "I just read your email. I am so sorry, this is unacceptable. We'll set up a meeting right away. I want to hear everything. I need to know what happened. Are you still at the airport?" Aisha nodded, her voice firm. "Yes, I am. I will wait here. I'll send someone to escort you to the office immediately. Please stay safe and thank you for speaking up." Aisha ended the call, feeling a flicker of hope. She knew that David was a decent man, that he had always been supportive of her work, but she also knew that the airline was a huge corporation with its own intricate internal politics. She had no idea what he would do, but she had to trust that he would do the right thing. She rose from her seat and walked towards the nearest exit, feeling a sense of resolve settling within her. She was going to fight this, and she was not going to do it alone. She was going to leverage the privilege she had earned through her hard work to push back against the prejudice that had always been in her way, and she wasn't going to stop until she saw a change. Within the hour, a car arrived to escort Aisha to the airline's headquarters. The office was a hive of activity, bustling with the energy of a fast-paced corporation. She was led to a conference room, where she found David waiting, his expression a mask of concern and determination. He greeted her warmly, his handshake firm and reassuring. "Aisha," he said, his voice serious, "thank you for coming. I'm so sorry about what happened. This is not something I take lightly." They sat down at the conference table, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. Aisha recounted her experience, her voice steady but firm, her eyes unwavering. She detailed every moment of the flight, from the casual assumptions to the blatant accusations, from the captain's hostility to the security's intrusive search. She spoke with a clarity and a conviction that moved David deeply. She spoke of the countless individuals who were treated as such daily, how it was essential to protect them, even the ones she would never meet. She talked about the fear, the anger, the exhaustion. She told him about her grandmother and how her life experiences were so integral to her identity. He listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to anger to a deep sense of shame. When she finished, David sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Then he looked up at Aisha, his gaze clear and direct. "Aisha," he said, his voice low but firm, "I want you to know that I believe you. I am disgusted and deeply disappointed by what you have been through. This is not the kind of airline we aspire to be. This is not the kind of treatment we condone. This is not what this company stands for. And I promise you we are going to make changes, and I want you to lead that charge." Aisha felt a surge of emotion, a complex mix of relief, vindication, and a fierce sense of purpose. David's words, his genuine remorse and commitment to change, resonated deep within her. It wasn't just lip service. It was a sincere acknowledgement of the systemic issues that had allowed this injustice to occur. She had been heard, and more importantly, she had been believed. She took a deep breath, the weight of the past few days beginning to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of hope. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she had the power to effect real change. She nodded slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, David," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I appreciate that, and I accept." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need to act swiftly and decisively. First, we need to launch a full investigation into Captain Miller's behavior. I want to know everything. His training records, his passenger complaints, everything. We'll also need to review our security protocols to ensure that they are fair, equitable, and free from bias. I want a complete overhaul of our diversity and inclusion training, and that's not a suggestion, that's an order. This must be a company-wide culture shift, not just some PR campaign." He paused, his eyes meeting Aisha's. "And I want you to oversee it all. Aisha, you'll have the full support of my office and all the resources you need. I want you to be the architect of this change." Aisha felt a rush of adrenaline, a surge of energy that washed away the fatigue she had been carrying. This wasn't just about fixing a problem. It was about building something better, something more just, something more equitable. She had been given a chance to transform the airline, to make it a place where everyone felt safe and respected, where biases were challenged and prejudices were confronted. She felt a deep sense of responsibility, a heavy weight on her shoulders, but it was a weight she was ready to bear. She was finally in a position to make change. "I'm ready, David," she said, her voice full of confidence. "Let's get started." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Aisha, now spearheading the company's reform efforts, worked tirelessly, driven by her passion and her unwavering commitment to justice. She assembled a diverse task force, bringing together individuals from various departments, backgrounds, and perspectives. She held countless meetings, listening to the stories of employees who had faced discrimination, gathering their feedback, their insights, their experiences. She worked with consultants to create new diversity training programs that were more impactful, more engaging, more effective. She revamped the airline's security protocols, implementing measures to prevent racial profiling and other forms of bias. She established a confidential reporting system for employees to report incidents of discrimination or harassment without fear of retaliation. Her focus was always on accountability and systemic change. The investigation into Captain Miller's conduct revealed a pattern of complaints, a history of discriminatory behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. He was immediately suspended, and eventually, his employment was terminated. The airline issued a public apology to Aisha, acknowledging the injustice she had suffered and vowing to do better. The media attention was intense, with news outlets covering the story from every angle. The airline faced a barrage of criticism, but Aisha, with David's support, remained steadfast, using the attention as an opportunity to promote the company's commitment to reform. She went on numerous interviews, speaking candidly about her experience and the steps the airline was taking to address the issues. Her poise, her intelligence, her unwavering dedication won over skeptics and inspired hope. The change wasn't easy. There was resistance from some employees, those who were unwilling to confront their own biases, or those who felt threatened by the company's new direction. But Aisha persisted, working to build a culture of empathy and understanding, one conversation, one training session, one policy change at a time. Slowly, she began to see the impact of her work. She saw more diverse faces in the airline's advertisements. She heard more diverse voices in the company's meetings. She saw more diverse representation in management and on the ground. She saw the airline begin to transform, not just on the surface, but at its very core. She started receiving anonymous messages from passengers, stories from crew members, messages of support, messages of thanks. Her work had not only changed an organization, but people's lives, and that was what mattered most to her. A few months later, Aisha boarded another flight, this time with a sense of calm and confidence. She was still Aisha Davis, but she was no longer a ghost. She was the architect of a new reality, a change agent who had turned her personal ordeal into a powerful catalyst for progress. She walked through the cabin, greeting the flight attendants with a smile. She noticed the way they interacted with the passengers, with more warmth, more empathy, more understanding. She saw the changes she had worked so hard to create. She took her seat and settled in, looking out the window at the sprawling landscape below. As the plane took off, she closed her eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace. She had fought for justice, she had spoken truth to power, and she had won. The battle had been exhausting, but she knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many inequalities to confront, so many biases to dismantle. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph, a moment of gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference. As the plane soared above the clouds, she thought of her grandmother, her face etched in her memory. She knew her grandmother would be proud of her. She had carried on her legacy of strength, courage, and resilience, and would continue to do so always. The future was still unwritten, but she was now holding the pen. She was no longer just reacting, she was creating. She was ready for whatever came next. She had found herself in the flames of injustice and had emerged whole and stronger than ever.
Hey, want to listen to another best story? Then click the floating video and subscribe for more.